Yokoso owashitare. Welcome back. And today's story is the first of an entire section of stories that explore the strange coincidences, the weird occurrences that happen in our lives that make you question whether or not there is something beyond our physical senses that is controlling things behind the scenes, and whether or not you do believe that there is something bigger than us out there, or that these stories are even real at all. I'll leave that up to you. At the very least, I can give you these stories, and hopefully you can get a little bit of entertainment from them at the very least. So, with all that being said, let's get on with the story. Once upon a time, ima wa mukashi, there was a man who lived in the province of Tajima, in the district of Shitsumi, and the village of Kawayama. Very specific place, and yet we do not know this man's name. His name goes unmentioned despite knowing very accurately where he supposedly lived. And now the text doesn't mention this, but given the fact that he owns a fairly large house with a garden, as you shall see, but also given the fact that as we go through some of these stories, you will see that most of the characters that this collection of stories deals with are usually somewhat well off and above the peasant class. It doesn't seem to particularly like talking about peasantry. And so it's probably safe to assume that because this man had a house, and the house was big enough to contain a garden, he was probably doing fairly well for himself. And he was living a very happy, productive life as far as any of us can see. But the most important people to him were his one wife and his one and only child, a little girl who you would count her age not in years but in months, so young that she couldn't stand or walk but got around by crawling. And one day this family was having a good time at home, and the text doesn't mention what the parents were doing, but they decided that they were going to take their little girl and put her out in the garden. Now again, it's safe to assume that surrounding this garden was a fence, and so the parents felt fairly secure in the fact that nothing was going to happen to their little girl. This was something they did all the time. They wanted her to get out and explore, to crawl around on her hands and knees, explore the flowers and the plants, and maybe even some of the bugs, and everything that the little world contained within this fenced area might have for her. And yet, as they were sitting there watching their little girl play around in the garden, suddenly, from the tops of their vision, something burst onto the scene. And the second that they realized that this thing was actually a gigantic, massive eagle, it had actually come in and snatched their little girl up and started taking off directly towards the east, soaring up into the sky with their one and only daughter. Now, of course, their parents were fairly quick to react to this despite the shocking nature of the whole thing, and both mom and dad tore off after this bird, trying to chase it down. The only problem is it being an eagle, it wasn't burdened by things like trees and rocks and differences in level of terrain. And if you've ever tried to outrun a bird that's flying full speed, you know how futile that is. And so despite these parents running with all their might, hoping, trying to, if not catch up to it, at least keep close enough that they could see where it was going so they could recover their little girl, ultimately, it was futile. This eagle just kept soaring off to the east and eventually flew off so far into the distance that it became very clear that these parents could do nothing. And the whole time they had been chasing this eagle, they had been weeping, tears streaming down their panic-stricken faces as they were chasing this eagle, this monster that took their only little girl from them. But they had to come to terms with the fact that their little girl was now gone, and there was nothing they could do about it. And so, with broken hearts, at least I'm assuming with broken hearts because I don't know any parent who wouldn't have a broken heart over this, they returned home with nothing else that they could do. And so, time went on. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, until about 10 years from this horrible occurrence had passed. And one day this man from Tajima, for whatever reason, had some business in the neighboring province of Tango, specifically in the district of Kasa. And so, packing everything up, he set out on a business trip. And he got to this province in this district and specifically made it to one of the villages in this district. And, as per the custom of the time, needing a place to stay, they didn't have inns per se. Instead, they would go up to a house that they felt fit their station and ask if they could stay the night, or stay a few nights, or however long they needed. Ask the people of the village to put them up for a little bit while they took care of whatever business they needed. And so, this man from Tajima did just that. He found a house, he introduced himself, explained that he was there on some business and was wondering if he could stay there for however long he was meaning to stay. The text doesn't mention it. And the head of the house, the man of the house, was happy to be of service. And so he brought the man into his house, he showed him around, and he introduced him to his family, his wife, and his one and only daughter, a young girl about 12 to 13 years of age. And again, while the text doesn't mention this, I am sure that this man from Tajima, seeing this other man who had a nice house, a wife, and an only daughter about 12 years old, the age his own little girl probably would have been had she not been so cruelly snatched up by a monstrous eagle. And so he probably, for a split second, felt a little pang of melancholy. But he quickly swept that aside and got down to business. And he turned to his host, the man of the house, and explained that he had been on the road for a long time and he was feeling a little grimy, and if it wouldn't be too much of a bother, he would like to know some place where he could, at the very least, wash his feet. And the man of the house was delighted to tell him that actually it was right about this time that his daughter would actually go to the village well by the road and draw up some water for whatever it is that they needed water for. And so, if his guest would like, he would send his daughter out to go get this water, and he could follow her to this well, whereupon he could take his own bucket, fill it up, and use that to wash himself off. And the man was glad to hear this and grateful for the opportunity. And so this man and this young girl set off towards the village well, which was by the big road. And the man from Tajima was the first to draw up water, and he took it in his bucket, and he went off to the side a little bit and began washing his feet. And then the girl of the house also drew up some water, and then right as she was getting the bucket into her hand, a group of village girls suddenly arrived, and they started poking fun and calling names and jeering at this other girl who was getting water. And they came over to her, and they surrounded her, and continued their ridicule, until eventually one of these girls got bold enough to actually snatch this bucket away from this girl. Now this girl, of course, wanting to do good by her family, immediately tried to take the bucket back, and eventually a small fight broke out. And as the insults were being traded back and forth, all of these girls with one accord looked at this girl and said, "You're nothing but a bunch of eagle's leftovers," and then promptly followed that up with some other insults and expletives probably. And then after saying these things to this little girl, one of them finally got fed up with it and struck her. It doesn't explain what manner in which, whether it was a punch or a slap. Honestly, it doesn't really matter. And also, given the nature of the Japanese language, it's very possible that they could have hit her multiple times. Needless to say, this girl of the house was being bullied by all of the village girls. And after she was struck, to nobody's surprise, she began crying. And so, with tears streaming down her face, she ran on home. Now, the whole time this was going on, the man from Tajima, who was washing his feet and just about wrapped everything up by the time this whole thing ended, had seen everything that happened. And some of you may be upset with this man, like, why didn't he step in? Why didn't he stop this? You have to remember that this was a different time. People had different values, and also, he didn't know what he would be getting into. Maybe if he stepped in and he insulted some other villageman's daughter, and this villageman happened to be somebody very, very powerful, who knows what could have happened. And so instead, he simply watched the whole thing, made a mental note of everything, and then also followed this girl back to her house. And when they both arrived again, the girl of course was crying, and her dad, the man of the house, saw this, and immediately asked her, "Hey, what's going on? What happened? Why are you crying?" However, she was crying so hard and so distraught by this whole thing that she couldn't say anything. She couldn't put her problems into words. And so the man from Tajima, who was witness to the whole thing, explained to his host exactly what happened, that they had come, that they had taken her bucket, that they had called her all sorts of names, and specifically one thing that they kept repeating was the phrase, "You're nothing but eagle's leftovers." And this is an unusual insult. Why would you call somebody that? And perhaps it was because he had his own bad experience with eagles. But something possessed this man from Tajima to ask his host, "If you don't mind me asking, why would they be calling her eagle's leftovers? That seems very strange." And at this, the host simply sighed and told his guest this story. "Many, many years ago, I was actually out walking near the village around here, when all of a sudden I saw a giant eagle fly over into its nest and drop something in there, which I found a little bit strange because normally eagles don't just drop things into their nest. But I didn't think anything of it until I heard the sound of a child crying. And so very curious, I then climbed up this tree and looked into this eagle's nest, and I saw a little girl, a baby. And of course, without a second thought, I got her out of this nest, got her down from this tree, and then I brought her home to my wife, and as we had no children, we began raising her as our own. And somehow or another, this story made it to the village girls, and that is why they were calling her Eagle's Leftovers. Now you can imagine that when the man from Tajima began hearing this story, his eyes went wide, and his mouth probably was agape, and his mind started racing, because he was starting to make some connections. But he didn't want to jump to conclusions just yet. But of course, he also very distinctly remembered the exact date that his little girl was taken from him by an eagle which flew off east, which just so happened to be the direction that the province of Tango was in, which is where he currently was. And so with a bit of a shaking voice, he asked his host, Do you remember the date that this happened? And his host answered, You know what? I actually do. And upon telling him this date, which the text doesn't give us, but he told this man the date that he had found this child, and it was the exact date that he had lost his daughter. And now the man was almost positive that this was his lost little girl. However, he had one more question. Have you heard anything about who her original parents are? Is anybody else looking for children that had been snatched up by an eagle? And his host simply looked at him, noticing his guest's exasperated voice and appearance, and said, No, we haven't heard a single thing about children being snatched up by eagles, let alone the parents for this girl. And at this, the man from Tajima was almost on the verge of tears, and he explained that a little over 10 years ago, his own little girl was snatched away by an eagle that flew off into the east towards the direction of Tango. And he told his host, Your little girl is my daughter. Now the host, of course, was shocked to hear this. This came out of nowhere. Are you serious? But again, even though he had raised this girl, she was not his daughter by blood. And he had probably spent many days wondering where this little girl came from, and maybe if somehow he could get her in contact with her original parents and what to do in case he found them, but you know, just all those things that you might think about when such a crazy occurrence happens. And so the host called this girl over, this girl that he had raised as his daughter, and he sat her next to the man of Tajima and looked at both of them very closely. And the more he looked, the more he could see the similarities between them, the various features that they shared, and they were like carbon copies of each other. And so the host was now convinced that this girl was this man's missing daughter. And when the host told his guest this, both of these men, so utterly moved by the situation, began weeping together. I mean, can you think of a more emotional situation to be in? And after further discussion through their tears, both men came to the conclusion that there was something bigger, that there was some sort of karmic causality that eventually led to this man from Tajima coming to this house and meeting his daughter that he had lost 10 years ago. And while the man of the house was indeed very sad to give this girl up whom he had raised as his own daughter back to her rightful parents, he was also a good man and understood the implications of everything that was going on. And so, with a heavy heart, he turned this girl over to her rightful father. But he did come to this man from Tajima and explained, You know, sir, I acknowledge that you are her rightful father, but I have raised her these past 10 years and she means so much to me. And so I ask of you, if we can both raise her together, what do you think of such an arrangement? And the man from Tajima turned to this other man who not only was hosting him, but who had saved his daughter from an eagle's nest and raised her to be a good, healthy, young girl, probably did feel a certain sense of indebtedness to this man. And so, understanding that this man also felt very deeply for his little girl, he agreed, and they promised each other that what they would do is they would have this girl go back and forth between their houses every once in a while, and so they could raise them together. Which, given the time period, was probably a really good setup for this girl, as she now had two families backing her and making sure that her interests were properly looked after. And then the text muses on this whole situation. How usually when eagles snatch up prey and take it back to their nests, they don't usually just drop it in and leave it there. They usually begin feasting right away. But for whatever reason, this eagle did not do that, and happened to drop this little girl in its nest just as this man was passing by. which was a very, very strange thing indeed. And the text further expounds that this must have been some sort of karmic bond from a past life. And thus is it said that parents and children have a mysterious, strong, and fantastical karmic bond between them. And that is the story. I don't have anything in the way of cultural commentary, only that I actually really do enjoy the story. This is a very good story. And this would be a great story to turn into an episode of Mushishi or something like that, because Mushishi is great, by the way. That's probably my favorite anime. But anyway, if you enjoyed the story, please give the video a like, and if you're a fan of Japanese history, Japanese storytelling, or just storytelling in general, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because this is only one of many, many more stories to come. And if you can think of other similar stories from other cultures, please let me know in the comments because I'm very curious to see how Japanese this story is as compared to other stories. And also don't forget to spread the word, share with everybody, share with your weeb friends who will appreciate a little bit more knowledge about Japanese culture. Share with your storytelling friends who have binged all of their favorite shows and are looking for something else to put on before they go to bed. And if you've been watching all the way up until the end here, I thank you sincerely. Ito katejike no koso haberi kere. And hopefully we will see you here for the next one for a story that I'm not exactly thrilled to get into because it's... Oh boy, let's just say that you probably aren't going to want to listen to this next one with the kids nearby because it's just... Anyways, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much, and we will see you in the next one. Goodbye.